I loved what you said about connecting with people that bring you joy. And I just heard a great quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who passed away recently, that like, hang out with people whose eyes light up when they see you. And I think for men, many of us are stuck in some relationships that are not healthy for us. It's whether maybe we're not hanging out with bullies, but there is such a tradition of men in the last couple thousand years where we are in these pecking orders of power. And it's hard for us to step aside from those. And this is often at work, where we're like the boss is not necessarily having healthy relationships with everybody else, but we feel stuck and like we have to stay with those. But you don't have to. You can go find the people that are, that are excited to see you, that are lit up, and that's going to help you come alive.
So I'm really excited about our show today on the Workplace Therapist Show. Today, of course, I'm your host, Brandon Smith. Today, we've got Ed Frauenheim. Now, I've had Ed on my sister program, the Leadership Foundry Show, and he talked about his experience working at Great Place to Work and some of the research they did around leaders. That's not what we're going to talk about here today. Ed's actually also the author of Reinventing Masculinity, the Liberating Power of Compassion and Connection. So in sticking to our theme, a little bit deeper dive into the human soul and self-awareness, we're going to talk about what does it mean to be a guy going forward, and what does it mean to really be masculine, how the old school way of masculinity really doesn't work for us anymore. And that shows up both in the workplace, but even at home and in our relationships. So listen really close. Ed's got his 5 C's that come from his book. They're really, really enlightening. We end up with some therapy conversations of our own on the show. So I hope you find those really, really helpful and relatable. And at the very end, of course, I'll go through my notes and share some of the things that I took away the most from the show that are really going to stick with me. So I hope you enjoy the show.
I'm Brandon Smith, and you've known me as the workplace therapist. My passion and purpose has always been to cure workplaces from dysfunction and to make your work life better. But did you also know I'm the co-founder of the Leadership Foundry? Well, in addition to our platform, we're excited to share that we're launching the Leadership Foundry podcast this January as a result. This podcast is free, and these curated episodes will answer the questions you have as a leader right now. Things like, how do I more effectively delegate so I'm not doing all the work of my team? How do I communicate more effectively so we're all on the same page? How do I manage my time and help prioritize? And meetings. We all know meetings are such a pain for all of us. Catch these episodes and the first episode on January 10th on iTunes, Spotify, and your other favorite podcast platforms.
Ed, I'm so excited to have you on my show. Now, this is not your first time for us being on a show together. You were on the Leadership Foundry Show in January, and we had some great conversations about your experiences working at the Great Place to Work and all that research you did around leaders. And we spent a solid 30 minutes, and it felt like so wonderful conversation talking about the future of leadership. Now, today, we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to talk about perhaps even the future of masculinity, because I think you've done some really fascinating work around what it means to be masculine today and even reinventing masculinity. In fact, your book that just recently came out was Reinventing Masculinity, Liberating Power of Compassion and Connection. So I love this topic because, if we're asking for the world to become more compassionate, we're also asking for 50% of the population to become more compassionate, and that happens to be males. And what does it mean to be masculine today? And we're seeing some of that in just the general media and kind of the ecosystem and vibe about that changing. But boy, to talk to you about it today, I'm really, really excited. So thank you, Ed, for coming on the show today.
It's my pleasure, Brandon. Really pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, it's really, really exciting. So before we jump into our topic today and jump into your book, I would love for listeners that maybe didn't catch the show we did on the Leadership Foundry podcast, the loyal listeners to hear the Workplace Therapist Show. So tell a little bit more about your background. What was your journey up to this point as a profession, and what got you so interested in this particular topic?
Sure. I am a writer by trade, Brandon, and I really got my start as a daily journalist in the Oakland Tribune chain of newspapers. Over the course of about 20 years, I was at some technology trade publications like CNET, Then I ultimately gravitated toward writing about work issues and HR and leadership at Workforce Magazine. About 7 years ago, I joined Great Place to Work, as we talked about before, which is the research and employee experience expert that puts together the annual Fortune 100 Best Companies to Work For list. And I was doing research and content and writing about workplace issues for them for up until last December. It is a great place to work, by the way. But I left in large part to focus on this topic of masculinity. And I had just published the book you mentioned. Thanks for surfacing that. And the reason why I hit on masculinity, you could say there's sort of three streams that cross there. For one thing, it's a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart because I never really fit that we call the confined masculinity very well. That's sort of those man box rules of being able to be strong and stoic, really competitive, kind of domineering or dominant. And I was like skinny. I lost my one fist fight. I didn't rise up the corporate ladder super fast. It just was really a challenge for me to feel good about myself as a guy. And along the second stream was that I kind of started to see over time, and you probably have seen this in your work as well, that the workplace was calling on men to show up differently in the last 5 or 10 years, especially in the last 3 years, say since the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, where we're being asked to be better listeners, to recognize our privilege, to operate in a more collaborative style, not just a competitive one, to be warm as opposed to that sort of emotionally cold kind of guy that was kind of the John Wayne stereotype. And lastly, I would say that I really see the way we show up as men is vital to our world's fortunes right now. To think about solving these giant collective problems like climate change and world conflict, geopolitical conflict, and social and political polarization. A lot of that, I think, is caused by that kind of retrograde masculinity that doesn't really see common solutions, that doesn't see a large circle of connection, but is really kind of self-oriented and isolated. So because of that kind of personal experience, the professional experience, and then the sort of public service, you might say, I really wanted to dive into this topic of masculinity.
Yeah, so then you started this process of writing the book. So I definitely want to get into the book, and I encourage all the listeners to purchase a copy. Mm-hmm. But before we get into the actual book, tell me about the research process you took. How did you dive into this? This seems like both powerful and important, but I wouldn't know where to begin, frankly, Ed. I have to give a lot of the credit there, not most of the credit, to my co-author, Ed Adams. We had this neat partnership where Ed came from the world of psychology and counseling men and creating a men's group called Men Mentoring Men that was really successful. It's been around for 30 years now. He brought the sort of personal growth element, and I brought the professional workplace element, and we both shared that interest in the broader societal issues. But a lot of the research behind the book is stuff that came out of Ed's work at the American Psychological Association. He chaired the group within the APA that focuses on the treatment of men and boys. And there had been a new study that was really an anchor to our book that came out a couple years ago that was new guidelines. It basically said if you are rigidly adhering to those traditional masculine values, you're not as healthy because you don't connect with people enough. You tend to be more lonely. You tend to not go to the doctor because you don't show self-compassion. Your relationships suffer with your spouse. And so we were, relying on all that research that kind of summarized a lot of work over the last 30 years or so in psychological studies. And then what I brought was kind of noticing all the trends within the workplace and including research at Great Place to Work, where we found that, and we talked about this in the other show, Brandon, that the best leaders, the ones that were the most productive, that had the greatest agility and innovation on their teams, that held their people the best in terms of retention, those folks were
showing up differently when they're from that typical male model. They were humble. They were about purpose. They were about building bonds of trust within their team and beyond. And so it really required people to show up as like agile and warm and connected, as opposed to that older way of being kind of rigid, cold, and isolated. So that research, was definitely something we talked about in the book, and it is in concert with stuff from like Brene Brown and talking about the power of vulnerability and courage, and how that's needed for high performing teams, psychological safety. These are all things that really call on men to show up differently.
So I'm glad you brought up Brene Brown. It might have been in her book, Daring Greatly. I can't remember. But I remember she told this story. She was so I'm going to do the best I can to honor her story. So she was at some kind of a talk, and she'd given the talk, and an older gentleman came up afterwards. And he said, well, do you do much studying on men and vulnerability? And at that time, she really hadn't. And she said, well, no, not really. And his response has stuck with me. He said, well, isn't that convenient? He said, because, we really aren't very good at it. But even he even gave this example. He said, but I don't think my daughters or my wife would appreciate me being vulnerable. They want me to be this like tough guy that's stoic and the rock, and they're vulnerable, and I'm the guy they can lean on. And she really didn't have a response to that, and he kind of walked away. So I think that's also a really interesting kind of starting place for this. That I think sometimes men reinforce the stereotype, sometimes cultures reinforce the stereotype. That's kind of out there.
Sure, and women in particular, as you're getting at, in terms of daughters and wives, and in our book, Ed has seen in his patients that can be one of the biggest catalysts, either a man being able to move from this confined old masculinity to what we call a liberating masculinity, or not. If his spouse supports him, makes space for him to cry, makes space for him to be uncertain about his future, to make space for him to answer his true calling as a in terms of his life's work. So maybe he's not as much the provider, that role that men are often feeling pressure to play. Women can really stifle that, but they can also accelerate it by being open to that kind of growth in men. So it's a great point that in that story, and I think that men have to own this transition themselves, but women can play a huge role in supporting us as we try to move past that kind of harmful socialization.
Yeah. So you mentioned of course, all the reasons why we need to. Gosh, I wrote down the list, try to catch up with you. You're not lonely if we don't do this. Our relationships suffer. We don't have compassion for ourselves or for others. We don't, frankly, go to the doctor. I mean, a whole host of things, which is really not healthy at all. So in your book, I know you mentioned there's 5 C's for making the shift. I would love to dive into those a little bit. So
sure.
What are some of those C's?
The 5 C's that we identified are curiosity, courage, compassion, connection, and then commitment. And to say a bit about each of these, the curiosity piece is, kind of starting to ask questions about, first of all, the way we've been trained to be men, but also about anything. It's sort of recovering or being reminded that we are curious beings as human beings. But for a lot of boys, that sense of wonder about the world, why is the sky blue? How do airplanes fly? It gets shamed out of us, by high school or college, because, or certainly the work world, the early years, because you're taught to be the know-it-all, the smartest guy in the room. These days, you can't be that if you're going to succeed. Microsoft CEO has this great line: we got to move from being know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. And that requires curiosity. It also requires vulnerability, to say, I don't know the answer. So that's that first C. It's related to courage, because if you are going to start showing up as vulnerable, it does take courage to say, I don't know it all. But we're also calling for courage. Men are courageous in the physical realm. They're courageous in the financial realm. Burning buildings and rescues, or betting the farm on an idea. But we're asking men to go into the emotional realm with courage, and to sort of face fears around, am I loved? And could I be having a closer relationship with my kids right now? What are some of the scars that I carry from childhood? And this is an ongoing challenge. I just was realizing with some of the organizations I founded, Brandon, and just this week even, I was like, if I don't hold these things so tight, maybe people will all leave and they won't like me and the thing will fail, and it's like, that's an old kind of version of success that men are often, held to. Is your product succeeding, or your legacy? But it took me courage to admit that to some of my team members, and they were like, dude, we love this place. We're not going to stop meeting and having this teal team, and that's the teal team that I've co-founded. So courage is the second one, and it can lead to beautiful things. Compassion is the third, and connection. Those are kind of the heart of it, really. Like, can we not just demonstrate compassion in our actions in men, but start being explicit about it? Because we do show compassion when we earn money for our families and sacrifice, and doing jobs we often don't even love to earn money. But we're asking for men to sort of start having compassion, starting with ourselves. You mentioned the term self-compassion before, and how many men beat themselves up but aren't super kind to themselves, don't act as friends to themselves, and the hurts we feel, because that suggests we're not tough, and once we do that, it can make it easier to start sharing it with other people. And we know that there's a lot of power that comes out of compassion in terms of creating psychological safe teams, improving your relationships, etc. The connection one is related again. Like, can we move away from thinking we have to do it all by ourselves and that we have to be the rock, like you said, the island? I love that Simon and Garfunkel song, "I Am a Rock, I'm an Island," but it's a myth. We are interconnected. The COVID pandemic taught that better than anything, right? Like we rise and fall as a whole globe, really. And for us to sort of take relationships more seriously, there's a decline in friendship. There's an increase in loneliness. There's an increase in suicide among men. And to help us see that we can forge these bonds, we can be vulnerable to each other, love each other as men, as brothers. It's an old idea, but we got to remember it. And the fifth C of commitment is just sticking with it, because it's going to be hard. Like, as I said, I'm having to do this on a weekly basis, and I wrote the damn book, So can we find habits? Can we do things like build a meditation practice, which can help with that self-compassion? Can we have a standing date with a good friend, a good male friend, or join a men's group? There's plenty to be done, but the commitment piece is necessary. Otherwise, it's easy to backslide.
Brother, I'm right there on this journey with you. It is not easy, my friend.
Give me an example for you, Brandon.
So I'll give you an example. So here we are. We're January, and I spent a lot of time reflecting on my family and my relationships with my extended family, not my immediate family in my house. I feel pretty good about that, but my extended family. And I realized, I've worked very hard to play a certain role, thinking I was going to get appreciation or acknowledgement because I played this role. But those relationships are really not good relationships, and they're really not the relationships I want. And it's been really challenging for me. And there's been a lot of hurt personally around that I feel like I've just been neglected or overlooked or abused or taken advantage of by a lot of family, to be frank. And here's where it manifests itself, which is, I think, really challenging for us. A mentor shared with me, he said, whenever you see someone get angry, it often is a sign they're protecting something vulnerable. So I noticed myself really angry the last 30 days, 45 days, Ed. Just mad, frankly, just pissed off at all these family relationships because they're family. And these are people who are supposed to love you. I don't feel like they really love me or they're my fans. And so it's really hurtful, but it's manifesting in this other way, which doesn't feel very inviting, right? No one wants to hang out with somebody who's angry and mad all the time. So I think, and I'm working through that. And then I've got a mentor who's both, he was a former therapist and then turned coach. His name's Len, and Len's 76 years old. And I've known Len for decades. Fascinating guy. And, he's been working with me on this. And he's like, Brandon, you got to kind of give compassion to yourself. You got to kind of love yourself. I'm like, I don't really know how to do that, Len. He's like, well, think of that Brandon who's 7 years old, and you got to love him. I'm like, like, yeah, he's okay, but I'm really having a hard time like giving that dude a hug. So I'm working through all this stuff that you're talking about here today in real time. And it's now on the positive, I've been making an inventory. Well, what relationships really do give to me? Who are the people who really do love me who reach out to me? And how can I be more proactive in connecting with them? So I've been texting friends more, trying to find times to connect. Now, the pandemic has not helped, to be frank, because, I want to see these people. I mean, there's one of my very good friends, and I haven't seen him in probably 2 years. And so that makes it challenging. But I've been trying to be more proactive. But it's an emotional place to be in. Is probably the best way to sum it up.
Yeah, and we often aren't. Thank you for sharing all that. I love that, and that's a hard place for us to feel comfortable with as men. Pretty much the only emotion we are sanctioned to have is anger, and also maybe content. But all the ones in between, and like you said, anger is often a mask for sadness and fear. I learned that in an anger management class myself, when I was trying to raise my daughter, and I was saying that she had an anger problem. She's like, Dad, so do you. You should go get anger management. I'm like, okay, fine, I will. I learned that.
Did you pound your fist on the table when you said it? Fine, I will.
I did. Right. But then I loved what you said about connecting with people that bring you joy, and I just heard a great quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, passed away recently, that like, hang out with people whose eyes light up when they see you. And I think for men, many of us are stuck in some relationships that are not healthy for us. It's whether it may not be, maybe we're not hanging out with bullies, but there is such a tradition of men in the last couple thousand years where we are in these pecking orders of power. And it's hard for us to step aside from those. And this is often at work, where we're like the boss is not necessarily having healthy relationships with everybody else, but we feel stuck and like we have to stay with those. But you don't have to. You can go find the people that are, that are excited to see you, that are lit up, and that's going to help you come alive as a guy too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely a challenge. I see that a lot. I think my particular flavor of some of that challenge is, if anything, I'll just say, well, I'll just do it by myself. So then I'm just by myself, and I'm like, wow, you just be by yourself. Don't ask for help. Just do it by yourself. And after doing that for quite some time, Ed, I'm like, that's really lonely and kind of tiring, and and it's not really fulfilling and fun. And it's hard to have. And one of the things that I've really learned about myself is intimate relationships are really important to me. And that's really what I want for the latter, well, I wouldn't say the latter half of my life, but, when I think about what's the years that are remaining, which hopefully are many, I just really want intimate relationships. That's what really matters most to me. And that requires work. And it takes two parties to dance too. As my mentor Len would say, whenever you have those kinds of conversations, those deep conversations or adult conversations with someone, it's an invitation for them to grow up. They may decline the invitation. So, I think it's just an interesting challenge to be. I mean, to be a man wanting more intimacy is not necessarily easy.
I agree. And you're right that you can get shot down, and that can be disappointing, or you can be even worse, like mocked, say. But then you get information, and maybe this is not the person I'm going to devote as much time to, if you've really come at it in an open-hearted way. The flip side is and I'm hoping this is true for you, and I'm curious. There's so much richness in those intimate relationships, and I'm thinking about, men often think the only intimate relationship they can have is with a spouse. But when you start building other kinds of relationships with men and women, there is a whole universe that can open up. And I know that in my own experience, I'm thinking about one good friend where we've had some of those kind of drag out arguments or conversations about, like, you annoyed me, or this hurt me, and both me saying it to him and him saying it to me. And we're both, I think, mature enough, barely, maybe in my case at times, like to grow from it,
Right.
And so right now, like we're we're bosom buddies, and I have a number of these really close male friends that I don't think I could have imagined how close we could have gotten and how much those relationships would mean to me. So I think that's a message to share with men. Like, a lot of guys even don't think of their best friend as someone they can talk to very in open-hearted ways and share their secrets and fears. But when you can have those kinds of relationships, the world becomes brighter, more colorful.
Yeah, agreed. And I think you just have to, it goes back to your comment around, you have to be courageous. You've got to be courageous enough to put yourself out there. And there's a vulnerability to that. But what have you got to lose? Just see what happens. As you were talking, and it made me think of two things. It made me think of that kind of famous Harvard study that studied kind of that men's lives over like an extended period of time. It was like a 50-year study, a longitudinal study. It might have even been longer, where they found that they correlated health and wellness and long life to number of friends. That was the biggest correlation to health, particularly for men, was how many friends you have. And if you've got less than 5, you got a problem. And if you got more, then it's good. And so I think there's definitely something there. Also, it made me think of, if you know who Esther Perel is, she's kind of a famous kind of couples therapist. She wrote a book called Mating in Captivity. And kind of one of her arguments is, in relationships, in modern relationships, we tend to want to put everything on our spouse. Like, our spouse is supposed to be our friend, our intimate partner, our playmate, our everything. And she says that's really not healthy, because that's really not how the world used to work. It used to be that our spouse played one role, and then we had work colleagues played another role, and we had friends that we did activities with, they played another role. But we're tending to put everything now in these romantic relationships as if they're supposed to be the end all be all. And her argument is, how can you have more of a community of people and relationships that can serve different needs and means, which I think is really healthy.
That rings so true to me, Brandon. And I, my own kind of sad story along those lines is to do with my father. Like, I mentioned him in the book and in a sidebar that when my mom died about 8 years ago, he lost that everything person, exactly as you're describing, where, he didn't feel like he needed anybody else in the world. And even though he had some really lovely friendships growing up and made some friends along the way, he became very isolated. And to this day, he still is largely lonely, which kind of breaks my heart. But at one point he said to me, I have lost perhaps the art of making new friends. And I was like, oh God. And it is hard to do that, especially for guys. But like you said, it deadens us and it kills us. It both like kills our spirit and then kills our body when we do not have those connections, and not just with the spouse, like you're saying, but with a wider network of friends and colleagues.
Okay, so this may be a tricky question for you. Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay, so let's say we've got a male listening to this, and I'm going to ask you about females and how they may be able to support their male friends and partners through this journey. But let's have a male listening to this, and they're nodding their head and they're saying, "Yeah, I don't really have a lot of friends, and I'm pretty stoic at home, and I feel like I got to be the tough guy, and I'm kind of on an island, and probably show up that way at work too." So they're kind of checking off the box on all these. Where should they start?
I think we listed those C's in somewhat chronological order. It doesn't have to go that way, but just starting to ask questions. Like, is this really the life you want? Is this as good as it gets? Are you seeing other people that seem to be thriving, and maybe you're curious about how they're living? Like, even if they're listening to your show regularly, like the kind of spirit you bring, Brandon, to your work. And I think that is, but then they can, or maybe they want to start somewhere else. But I think starting to ask the question, how can I maybe change my life? And how can I change how I show up at work? That's a great place to start. And I would say, in terms of just the friendship piece, a great place to start is to go back to your friends when you were a kid. those bonds can be surprisingly strong. And I say that out of experience. Like a couple of years ago, I was added to a text thread with like 13 of my middle school and high school buddies, all guys. And mostly we talk about sports, but there's these lovely moments also where we'll talk about challenges with raising our kids. I had a heart attack last year, and these guys were so supportive of that. We talk about heavy stuff along with the light, and then now some more like individual conversations have happened along the way. So those are people that loved you at the start of your life, and often you can rekindle those bonds. Not always, but I think that's one place that is promising.
I love that, Ed. Actually, it's funny. You said curiosity and you started there. That's not where I thought you'd take it. I loved where you took it. I love that you said, get curious about the vision for your life and your relationships, and almost do a little inventory about what you've got and where you want to go. And then you said, look to your friends that you've always had, or those high school friends. In my case, I've got a college roommate that I was really close to in college, and I still think of him as a best friend. And every time we get together, it's like we click. I don't think I've talked to the guy in 4 years, maybe 5. Mm-hmm. I know if I picked up the phone, it'd be like yesterday. But why have I not picked up the phone? Why have I not talked to him? So it's definitely reminded me of some things there. But where I thought you were going to take this was get curious about others. Because curiosity and empathy and intimacy have such a strong relationship. It starts with someone being curious in order to build any kind of intimacy. And if you want to see something really, really sad, go out to dinner on any given night and look at those families and couples at the tables around you. And you'll see people just staring at their phones in front of the other person. Like, here's this other human being with a life story right there in front of you. It's so way more interesting than Facebook, I promise. And it's real. It's right. Like you can touch them. You can reach right over there and just poke them, and they'll poke you back. And yet people just stay frozen on their phones. So I thought you were going to take it there, but I just wanted to throw that out there because as a big fan of intimacy and as a therapist by heart and a therapist trained, I'm just a fan of curiosity when it comes to people.
That's a great point. And I think it's easy for men actually to get lost in self-absorption, being only wondering about themselves. So I love the point of being others oriented as well. And just to bring it back to the workplace here too, like increasingly that's the recipe for success. Because if you remain, the old model was like, let me focus on my career. I'm the most important person in my world, and I got to find the way to get up the ladder. Guys that retain that sort of selfish approach are struggling more, or they're finding it more of an unwelcome approach because there's as we said, in the era of Me Too, of Black Lives Matter, there's an understanding that we have to acknowledge the need to help others rise as well and succeed. And so even if we're, a path to personal success has got to be more collective, and to acknowledge that, you may have worked hard and got to where you are through a lot of sacrifice and challenge, but we've had it easier than a lot of other people, actually, as white guys. Looking at you and me here. So if we don't start paying more attention, if we don't start empathizing with other people more, including other guys, and trying to help everybody thrive, then we are going to find ourselves less welcomed in organizations.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And the other part of that too is it's also recognizing and honoring people as whole people, and getting curious about who they are and where they are and where they want to go and what their needs are. And we're seeing that also as a thread and a theme for both effective leaders today, but what it means to be a future leader. So Ed, believe it or not, I can't believe our time's already running out. So if, on the Workplace Therapist show, I always like to ask this question. What's one life hack you have for us for how we can live a life more free from dysfunction and frankly, build better relationships and have healthier conversations with others? Any particular tips for us today?
Yes. This is going to be a kind of subcategory. tip, but then I'll widen it in a second here. If you have a spouse or you have a long-term significant other, I have found it's so valuable to have like a quarterly retreat. My wife and I go, either we book a hotel room or we go to one of the great hot pool resorts here in California for a night or two. And it's we've got 2 teenagers, but we've done this basically for our whole marriage. And it's been a great way for us to reconnect, be romantic, kind of reset our lives. We end up talking about, we often talk about the kids a lot, even though like we're getting away from them, but it's a richer kind of conversation. And even if you don't have a partner to do that with, I think the idea of retreating, of having moments to step back. I just am reading the book Wintering, and like the power of rest and retreat, even in the season of winter, can be really valuable to a healthier life and a happier one, I believe.
Ed, fantastic. I love that. So this has been an awesome conversation. If people want to learn more about you, follow you, get a copy of your book, Reinventing Masculinity, The Liberating Power of Compassion and Connection, where can they go?
Thanks for that offer, Brandon. They can get the book on Amazon. We also have a book website, reinventingmasculinity.com. And you can also find me on LinkedIn. And the organization I mentioned earlier, the tealteam.com, is another one where you can find me and some of my like-minded colleagues.
Fantastic. Ed, well, thank you. Keep up the great work. This has been a very meaningful conversation to me. It makes me feel good that I'm not alone in this journey. So it's a struggle, but it's an important one. So thank you for all the great work that you're bringing to the world. You enjoyed that show as much as I did. You probably got a sense from the show that I was bearing my soul too. I've been doing a lot of work on this topic myself because I think as human beings, we all want to be better versions of ourselves, and we've kind of got to move back some of those scripts that we were given us. And as a guy, I was given certain scripts. So I've been working through that as well. And Ed reminds us, he says, for guys, if we stick to this old school framing of masculinity, it can result in us being lonely. It can damage our relationships. We don't have compassion for ourselves or for others. Frankly, we don't even go to the doctor. And it's going to lead to shorter lifespans. So we really need to think about how we look at that differently. And of course, he offers our 5 C's. He says, curiosity, curious about where you want to go in the future. Like, what's your vision for yourself? And what do you want differently in your life and your relationships? Having the courage to be emotionally vulnerable and sharing a little bit more about your thinking and feeling with others. He talks about compassion, you be giving care to yourself and giving care to others. And then he moves right into connection. How can we build and rebuild the relationships that matter? And I think that's where you heard my story, that I've been doing an inventory of relationships right now in the season of life I'm in, and really thinking about the ones I want to reinvest in and invest in even further. And then commitment. And he said that's probably the hardest part. You have to stick with it. It's a journey. What I didn't get a chance to spend more time on with the conversation was how can women help men make this transition? But I think that's good for a future conversation. But I think it's a really good game plan on how do we change that, because that changes both the workplace, it changes families, it changes relationships in a way that we all need. So I hope you found this conversation as valuable as I did, and I look forward to hearing how it goes for you.